Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to the Blanco Center's Katrina Forward webinar. My name is Stephen Barnes. I'm the Executive Director of the Blanco Public Policy Center at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And our webinar today is the next installment in our Katrina Forward programming, which captures really a season of reflection looking back at the 2005 storms, the impacts of Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, as well as where Louisiana has come over the last 20 years as we think together about envisioning the future and the path ahead for the state. Today, I am pleased to be joined by two well-known and highly regarded economists to share some reflections on the economy of the state as we dive into an important priority area for the Blanco Center, that is poverty and economic opportunity. We will have two speakers today, one of which will be Terrell, a professor of economics at the E.J. Ourso College of Business and director of the Center of Economics, Business, and Policy Research at Louisiana State University. He joined LSU in 1996 after receiving his PhD at Duke University and spending 5 years at Kansas State. Dr. Terrell is working with state agencies on numerous projects related to Louisiana's economy and has co-authored 3 volumes of the Advances in Econometrics series and published in leading academic journals such as Economic Journal, Journal of Law and Economics, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. We'll also hear today from Dr. Gary Wagner, who holds the Acadiana Business Economist Eminent Scholar Endowed Chair in Economics, which is a position in the College of Business at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. In this role, he monitors national, state, and regional economic environments, conducts research and analysis, and develops and maintains external stakeholder relationships on behalf of the College of Business and the university. We'll start today with a presentation from Dr. Terrell, then we'll hear from Dr. Wagner, and we'll have about 20 minutes at the end of the webinar for some Q&A and some discussion. So as you're hearing the presentations, we invite you to share any questions that you'd like to have discussed through the Q&A feature of the webinar, and I'll rejoin after our 2 presentations to help guide us through some interesting discussion. With that, let me hand it over to Dr. Terrell.
Thank you, Stephen. What I want to talk about today is really what I've been doing for the last almost 30 years. I came to LSU in 1996, and I've been studying the the Louisiana economy ever since. So there we go. My background is that I started giving speeches about the Louisiana economy prior to Katrina, so I have some insight before Katrina. I was a volunteer at LSU during Katrina, and a lot of people, particularly when I go to my students and I ask them, what do you know about Katrina? They know very little. In a class of 120 principal students, most of them weren't born at the time of Katrina. So during Katrina, I was a volunteer on campus and worked in that effort. After Katrina, I worked with state agencies to track the economic recovery. We did surveys to ask people what they did during Katrina, how they came out in Katrina, and I've had 150 or more reports on the Louisiana economy. Also following Hurricane Katrina, the state decided to focus heavily on what's the impact of these hurricanes. So I've done economic impact studies for every disaster, starting with Gustav, including Laura, Ida, the BP oil spill, and so forth. So before we actually move to slides that show the data behind Katrina, I think it's really important to think about the human cost of Katrina. There were 1,400 people killed in New Orleans during Katrina. Above that, there are hundreds of people who lost loved ones during Katrina. There are thousands, over 100,000 people who were left on rooftops in the water, in the Superdome, waiting for days to be evacuated from New Orleans. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their home during Katrina. Even if you were one of the lucky ones whose home was not destroyed during Katrina, you went back and your children may not have a school to go to. Your job may be adversely affected. So the impact of Katrina was not like a normal storm. And that's something we're going to see in the graphs later as well. Normally, what you see during a hurricane is the hurricane comes in, uh, you see the devastation, and then you can go back immediately to try to recover. That was not the case during Hurricane Katrina. I'm really going to focus on and break things down by parish in some cases. And I'm going to focus on the parishes that we focused on back then for Southeast Louisiana. St. Tammany is on the North Shore. It was the least affected among the 5 parishes that I'm going to be talking about, but there was devastation. Orleans Parish, shaped like a bowl, when the levees broke, anything below sea level flooded. Uh, St. Bernard, actually the worst impacted in percentage terms of any parish, and then Plaquemines and Jefferson Parish. So, what did I do as one of the basic things after Katrina? Well, one of the more basic things that we wanted to do is just follow economic activity in the parishes to see how they were impacted and how the recovery was going. And if you look right here, different parishes had different impacts. The top line in this graph is St. Tammany Parish. And as you see, St. Tammany Parish showed a slight dip. This doesn't mean that there wasn't any impact. I could walk down the hallway and talk to a friend of mine whose house was wiped down to the slab in Slidell. But what we saw in St. Tammany Parish is there was no widespread flooding. You could get in immediately. You could start to set up for the reconstruction of New Orleans in St. Tammany Parish. If you look at the most affected parishes, the bottom blue line is St. Bernard Parish. The orange line is Orleans Parish. And Orleans Parish down almost 30% down at the peak after Katrina. And what we looked at in terms of these graphs is we followed things until 2008, and the pattern was optimistic. We see a bit of a recovery, and in 2008, insurance companies had started to settle claims. Early on, it was very difficult as insurance companies claimed that you really needed to file flood insurance and not wind insurance. So insurance companies were pretty slow to pay off. By 2008, they were paying off $10 billion to rebuild New Orleans. By 2008, the federal government was chipping in almost $75 billion. So there was a lot of money flowing into New Orleans to rebuild about 2008. And we were very optimistic that things were moving in the right direction. That being said, it's important to note that a 20% decline in number of businesses in Orleans Parish as of 2008 in this graph is a little different than saying all but 20% of the businesses returned to Orleans Parish. We also looked at the number of businesses that were closed, and 40% of the businesses that were in New Orleans prior to Katrina never reopened. So part of that gain and recovery is new businesses coming in to rebuild New Orleans, replacing those businesses that never returned. Overall, in the metro area of New Orleans, they were down by about a third as of 2008 that closed during Katrina and never reopened. Here's just some overall data that we see. And in the overall data, we see the change in number of firms, the change in employment, the change in population as peak. And you will see that in terms of populations, Orleans Parish, the city of New Orleans, was down over 50%. St. Bernard Parish, down almost 80%. Significant falls in Plaquemine Parish as well. If you look at some place like St. Tammany Parish, Tammany Parish, because you had a lot of people wanting to come back to New Orleans, and the North Shore was a place with some dry land, with the availability of housing, you saw an actual increase just after the storm, even though there was some devastation there. And you see that they're 25% above pre-Katrina levels today. Southwest Louisiana also saw damage in the wake of Rita. And one of the things that we abstract away from a little bit here, they're only down 1% between 2005 and 2006. When we analyzed the Workforce Commission data in more detail, a quarter of all firms that were in the Lake Charles MSA prior to Rita never reopened after Rita. You always see some churning of firms, but that's a really big impact from Rita that's sort of lost in this data. And I want to talk a little bit about the gains through today that we see in the data. For reference, I want to show GDP in Dallas. And I think it's hard for somebody who's a non-economist to understand patterns for New Orleans if you don't know what another city might look like. So for Dallas, we see a little bit of a downturn during the Great Recession around the housing crisis. We see a bit of a downturn around COVID. And in general, we see substantial growth. Real GDP in Dallas more than doubled over the period 2020 through 2024. In fact, another thing that I want you to focus on is that axis on the left axis, that's going to be a much larger number than we see for New Orleans. So for New Orleans, what we see is a very different pattern in GDP. Gary and I both do forecasts for Louisiana. And if we were doing forecasts for Dallas, our job would be a whole lot easier because you see that nice, smooth pattern in terms of every economic variable. And in Louisiana, and in particular in New Orleans, you see very interesting, very different patterns. And what we see in New Orleans is we see that the economy is much smaller than the Dallas economy. I'm going to return to that later. And we see that we're at about $84 billion of gross domestic product. That's the total amount of goods and services that are produced in the New Orleans economy prior to Katrina. You see a dip following Katrina, but it's not as bad as you'll see in some other variables because there is an immediate effort to try to rebuild New Orleans. In the wake of Katrina, some of our other research showed the highest job vacancy rate ever recorded anywhere in the US. So there were more openings for jobs that were not being filled in New Orleans than anywhere that we've ever seen. That's because the housing stock was reduced to rubble in New Orleans. There's nowhere to live. So it's very difficult to get workers. The wage rate increases were enormous in New Orleans after Katrina. Wendy's at one point was offering a $6,000 signing bonus and insurance to get workers in New Orleans at one location. So there was a huge demand for workers in the wake of Katrina. And what we saw is, remember, the entire economy in New Orleans is about $85 billion. The federal government is sending in almost $75 billion. Insurance companies are sending in $10 billion. That's about 1 year's output for New Orleans is being spent on rebuilding the city, being injected from somewhere else. And when that happens, as you finally get to build those homes, remember it takes a while for the insurance companies to pay out. It took a while for the LRA to send that out. It takes a while for people to hire contractors. And what you see is a huge boom as that rebuilding occurs. And then what happens after we spend the money? After we spend all that money, the economy contracts. And in fact, the economy contracts to a level significantly below the pre-Katrina economy. And we've never really hit the same size that we were prior to Katrina. I'd also like to look at some population numbers, and I want to do that to talk a bit about specific parishes. And I'm really going to focus on primarily Southeast Louisiana, but I do want to do one graph to look at the Rita area. So this is the population for Dallas-Fort Worth, just to show you what a typical area would look like. Dallas is pretty steadily rising. This is Lake Charles. And why am I not so focused on Lake Charles? The reason I'm not so focused on Lake Charles, it was a devastating storm. A quarter of all businesses pre-Rita failed after Rita. So we don't want to understate the importance of Rita. However, if we look at the long-term graph of the Lake Charles economy, what we see is that Lake Charles fully recovered by the year 2020. And in fact, they're much stronger. A lot of that growth around 2020 is the LNG export facilities going in and generating a lot of growth. Another thing that I want to point out about this graph that's pretty important is 2010 and 2020 are census years. And often you see a pretty big adjustment in census years because the estimates miss growth that's a little more gradual. So that growth between 2019 and 2020 is probably overstated a little bit. What do you say in 2021? In 2021, you see a significant decline in population in percentage terms. That's Hurricane Laura. And I think that's important because Hurricane Laura was a very destructive hurricane that's very similar to Hurricane Rita. So Lake Charles has had other destructive hurricane seasons that were similar to Rita in terms of the effect on the population, the effect on the economy. The other thing I want to say about Lake Charles is when I look up out of 370 MSAs, the slowest growing MSAs after 2020, so from 2020 to 2024, if you look up in the decline in population, the largest decline in population was in Lake Charles. But if you look at this graph, that's not as concerning because you have the impact of Laura, you have the impact of negative rulings on LNG export facilities in the Biden administration, and yet they're still well above where they were in 2019. Here is the New Orleans MSA population. And I want to say a few things about the New Orleans MSA population, and then I want to look at things by parish. What we see is a huge decline post-Katrina, and that's something that we always have to be aware of modeling. So in 2006, and a lot of that is New Orleans Parish, but it's also St. Bernard. It's also some of the other parishes that got hit really hard. Slowly, the population begins to recover, and by 2019, we're getting really close to where we were before. The decline that we see in 2020, and you're going to see this in a lot of graphs now, is that St. Tammany Parish was pulled out of the New Orleans MSA. Gary's going to talk about the combined statistical area, which does include St. Tammany Parish, and we're not going to see that huge decline if we include St. Tammany Parish, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if you look at worst performing metro areas in terms of population, 2020 to 2024, the second worst performing is the New Orleans MSA. So what's going on in terms of industries? Well, in terms of industries, tourism has been very strong. I just recently did an economic impact of the Super Bowl report. Super Bowl was a giant success, injecting over $1.2 billion into the New Orleans economy. Um, New Orleans has multiple events. If you ever go to New Orleans, it's a very unique city. Tourism is a huge engine of growth. And though we saw some declines from COVID, tourism is recovering to a large extent. So, where are we seeing declines if we look at economic variables like employment? Well, if we look at economic variables like employment, one sector is in manufacturing. Manufacturing is declining overall because of gains in technical efficiency, but the decline in manufacturing in New Orleans is significantly more than the overall decline that we would expect if they just kept with the national trend. And the other thing that we see is retail trade. I can tell a story that there's a move to Amazon and online retailers, but if I look at national data, national employment in retail trade is growing with population growth. So that the population growth is just not enough to spur on some of the feeder sectors that we'd like to see growing in the economy. Here's St. Tammany Parish. If I added St. Tammany Parish to the metro area, you can see that there's pretty steady growth. St. Tammany Parish would bump us up to near where we were prior to Katrina. Orleans Parish has lost about 100,000 people in the last 20 years. That's very similar to a story that I would have told prior to Katrina. Between 1980 and 2000, Orleans Parish lost 80,000 people. Jefferson Parish has generally been growing, but Jefferson Parish lost about between 25 and 30,000 people. If I look at the other parishes in the metro area, St. Bernard is down even more. Plaquemine, somewhere like Orleans, and then you're not going to offset that with gains in the outlying parishes that I don't have in my graph. So before I finish up, I really want to talk about some keys to understanding New Orleans. And I think it's important because as economists, we want to know, where do we go to the literature to understand how to improve things in New Orleans? So how is New Orleans like other metro areas? Can we just go to the literature on urban and metro areas and take out some of the solutions that other people have come up with and use them to generate solutions to problems in New Orleans, to generate ways to improve New Orleans? How does New Orleans differ from other metro areas? And then one important way that we differ is Katrina. So what did Katrina really do? So here's a graph of the city of New Orleans population, 1820 to 2020. One of the things that a lot of economists can tell you is in the year 1840, New Orleans was the fourth largest city in the US and the wealthiest city in the US. When you moved cargo and moved population, you did it in waterways. You did it through the ocean. And New Orleans was the corridor to the Mississippi, and they benefited from being the corridor to the Mississippi. There was pretty steady growth. I'll show you that some cities grew faster over that period, all the way up until 1960. And then what we see is after 1960, things have been headed down. And you'll remember that when I came to New Orleans and started talking about things around 2000, the population had already been declining. Here's a graph that I initially didn't plan to put in this presentation, but I think it's a really useful graph to look at. That looks like a really pessimistic graph on New Orleans, but it's not really a unique graph for urban areas in the US. What happened in 1950? Eisenhower was president. We were building better automobiles. We were building better roads. There were some federal programs that made it cheaper to go out and move your family to the suburbs, buy a house, uh, hopefully get a better quality of life, and just commute into your job in the city. So New Orleans wasn't unique in that. Detroit did exactly the same thing. And in fact, the trends actually accelerated in most urban areas because in the 1960s, we were starting to come to terms with racial issues. Also, as the middle class began to migrate out to suburban areas, the problems of poverty and crime and weaker education systems became a bigger issue. And as they became a bigger issue, some of the urban areas experienced more of a crisis. And it turns out, if I look at this, actually, New Orleans didn't have as big a problems as an area like Detroit. And these are within the city limits. So Detroit is kind of a weird comparison, but in terms of geographic area, New Orleans is a little bit bigger in terms of geographic area, but if you subtract out the land that can't be built on because of the geography, Detroit is about the same size as New Orleans. This next slide is hopefully a question that you'll find interesting. I was doing an interview on the Super Bowl, and my goal was, and what I prepped for, I was told that I was going to be asked about what was the great positive impact of the most recent Super Bowl on the New Orleans and Louisiana economy. And when the reporter got me on the phone, she said, I've already got enough information about the Super Bowl. What I want to know is why has New Orleans not kept up with Dallas and Atlanta since 1950? So why is it the case that Dallas and Atlanta both have over 10 Fortune 500 headquarters, and why does New Orleans not have that many Fortune 500 headquarters? Why are they growing? Between 1950 and 2000, Dallas added 3.5 million people. Atlanta added 3 million people. New Orleans added 700,000 people. So why is it the case? And this is prior to Katrina that we're looking at. So I don't think we should assume that we're not going to keep up with other cities. So one of the questions that we need to be aware of is prior to Katrina, what was the trajectory? And is it possible to gain on these cities? Even Detroit, where the city itself is really struggling, was adding population out in the suburbs. And from 1950 to 2000, when the city was losing uh, over half of its population, the metro area was adding 1.2 million people. And they still have, I think, 8 Fortune 500 headquarters in Detroit. So there seems to be a big difference between New Orleans and these other cities. So I want to focus on how is New Orleans like these other metro areas. Well, the first thing is that New Orleans did experience a flight to the suburbs. We saw people move first to Metairie, and then when I was here, those 80,000 people that left Orleans Parish, almost all of them went to St. Tammany Parish, or there was almost an equal gain in St. Tammany Parish between 1980 and 2000. In the most recent migration out of New Orleans, what we see is around 100,000 people leaving Orleans Parish, about 70,000 going to St. Tammany Parish. So you do see some movement to the suburbs, but you don't see gains in suburban areas as much as you do in an area like Detroit or like Atlanta or like Dallas. So there's something different about New Orleans. The other thing that's important is you don't see outlying MSAs like St. Tammany Parish moving from bedroom communities where a high percentage of the people commute into the rest of the MSA to their own MSA where most of the people work in that area and they're less associated with that area. And even though that's just a statistical change, I think those commuting patterns are important to come to grips with over a period of time. I think one important way that New Orleans is different from these other areas is in terms of geography. And if you go to AI and ask what was the reason for growth in Atlanta and Dallas, one of the things they're going to immediately talk about is easily accessible land for expansion, cheap building cost. They're going to talk about interstates and airports. If I go back to when sea travel was declining, we could talk about rail. So those are going to be important things. And our geography just isn't as suitable for building four interstates in and out of New Orleans. Our airport, and maybe we could expand Louis Armstrong. In fact, there are plans for a second terminal. But when you think about trying to build an airport the size of DFW, DFW has 10 times the land that Louis Armstrong does. Atlanta has a lot more land. Denver has a lot more land. So one of the things that's pretty important is just in terms of geography. When you start thinking about going out and just migrating to suburbs, where do you build these suburbs? What did Katrina do? In my opinion, Katrina accelerated existing trends, and it also created another important obstacle. The way that it accelerates existing trends is economic models often assume that everybody looks out every year and decides, hey, do I move to a new location or do I stay where I am? And they're going to compare wages, they're going to compare education, they're going to compare opportunities for their family. But there's a really big inertia there. And that inertia is caused by the fact that you own a house, you have a job, you have friends. And when Katrina hit and half the population left, the average business didn't reopen for 4.5 months, if it did reopen in New Orleans. Many families put kids in schools in another state and didn't come back for a significant period of time. So, what we're seeing is that it's not people just considering, do I try moving to a new location? Katrina forced people to try a life at a new location. And I think that accelerates existing trends, some of which were a little bit negative. And I think it creates another obstacle that I'll give Stephen credit for organizing this series to start with the coast. So this is the map that we normally see for the Louisiana coastline. And I asked somebody that worked for me to find, because I've seen these before, one of the ugliest maps of the Louisiana coastline that they can possibly see. And this is a U.S. Geological Survey map of the area in red being the area that's at or below sea level. And if you look at this, when we start talking about things like building suburban neighborhoods, when we talk about expanding into areas, there's a lot of marshland out there. Uh, I'm extracting away a little bit from the fact that we've actually done a pretty good job of building levees where we can build on areas that are below sea level. But even when you build below sea level, when you put a runway in land that's a little more marshy, you've got to reinforce it more than you would somewhere else. So some of our construction is going to be a bit more difficult. So when you look at the state of Louisiana and you look at the city of New Orleans, we really have to worry about our coastline. We really have to worry about those levees. We really have to tell a convincing story that our levees, which we've done an incredible job on and have shown themselves to be very reliable in a storm like Ida, we really have to tell the story that they're going to be rock solid reliable when we go out and try to recruit Fortune 500 companies, when we try to build economic development in the city of New Orleans. And I'd like to close on an optimistic note. I had the opportunity to go a week ago down for brunch in New Orleans. I had an incredible time. The city was looking like the city always looks: incredible culture, incredible food. There's so much potential and so much uniqueness in the city of New Orleans. I had a friend who hosted the Southern Economic Conference, and when he was president, he moved it from New Orleans to Dollywood, and he almost bankrupted the association because so few people came to the new site. So New Orleans is a very unique treasure, and it's something that can be built on.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the presentation and the perspective. And we'll move right into remarks from Dr. Wagner. Take it away, Gary.
Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. See if I can get this up to size. There we go. Yeah, so thank you, Stephen. I want to thank the Blanco Center for hosting the conference and hosting the webinar and inviting me to participate. I'll give you a little bit of background on myself and how I'm going to hopefully complement Deck's presentation. So I've been a professor for 25 years, having spent the last 8 here at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Prior to that, I was vice president and senior regional officer for the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and then I worked at a couple of different universities. So my perspective is going to be a little bit different in the sense that I don't have the ground level detail and experience that Deck has, having only been in Louisiana for a shorter period of time. But I do want to share some thoughts about the region and what I think are some of the challenges and some of the successes that we've had post Katrina. So I want to talk about kind of 3 broad points. I'll give you a quick story of resilience, focusing on some issues that Deck talked about. I want to talk about what I think successful regions look like and have looked like over the last 30 years, talk about how New Orleans compares, and then what are some of the challenges and obstacles to continued progress. So Deck talked about some of the population losses that the region experienced during Katrina, but when I was looking at the numbers, this really jumped out to me. So this is showing you, we have about 3,200 counties in the US. So this is showing you the 10 largest year over year losses in population for all 3,200 counties over basically a 50-year period. And you can see 5 of those actually occurred in Louisiana. 3 of those were from Hurricane Katrina, with St. Bernard Parish, Orleans Parish experiencing very significant population loss, Plaquemines Parish down about 24%, and also Hurricane Rita caused population loss over 20% in Cameron Parish. You can see also there's Vernon Parish, which occurred in 1976. That was a relocation of a military facility. So just from a perspective of the magnitude of what Katrina did population-wise, it's really unprecedented, the impact that this had over the last 75 years around most of the US. And so I think to me, it's an amazing picture of resilience. You know, my first trip to New Orleans was in 1999 for an economics conference. I've been back to New Orleans many, many times since then. And I think given the magnitude of the damage and destruction that took place, it's really remarkable, the recovery that has taken place. I also want to point out, I'm going to go through the presentation pretty quickly so we have time for Q&A, but if you are interested in the slides, feel free to email me. I'm happy to share those with you. I want to talk really quickly here about just the New Orleans MSA. So I tend to think about the New Orleans region encompassing these 10 different parishes, but Deck mentioned the MSA, which is a metropolitan statistical area. So it's a collection of counties or a collection of parishes that basically represent mini economies. They're based on commuting patterns. So for most of the presentation, I'll talk about the New Orleans MSA, which for our purposes is going to include Jefferson, Orleans, Plaquemine, St. Bernard, St. Charles, St. James, and St. John the Baptist. So just really quickly there. I also want to talk here about just how important the New Orleans region is to the state of Louisiana. So this figure is showing you the 9 metropolitan statistical areas in Louisiana and how much of the goods and services we produce statewide are accounted for by each region. So if we look at the New Orleans region, you can see basically 1/3 of all the economic activity that takes place in the state takes place in the New Orleans MSA. Obviously, the city of New Orleans being the largest city in the region, so it's really the hub of the MSA. When you add the Baton Rouge MSA to the New Orleans MSA, basically 55% of all economic activity that takes place in the state really centers around those two MSAs. And I think this is important because as Deck pointed out, talking about comparisons with Dallas and Detroit and Atlanta, what happens in New Orleans and the success and resilience of New Orleans is really important for the future of not just the New Orleans region, but it's important for the entire state of Louisiana as well. So let me jump into what successful regions look like and what I mean by that. So I think, first of all, there's obviously many ways you can think about a successful region, which is why I put quotation marks around the term successful region. Uh, Per capita income is one of the ways that one of the economic metrics that we have tracked very consistently for a very long period of time. It also correlates very closely with many other quality of life indicators that people talk about. And what this map is showing you is it's breaking up the more than 380 different metropolitan statistical areas into the country in terms of their income quintiles. So the dark orange areas are the highest per capita income earning MSAs in the country. The dark blue are the lowest 20% of income earning MSAs in the country. And the point I wanted to get across with this picture, I know it's hard to see Louisiana, I'll zoom in on them in just a minute, is really you have a lot of variation around the US. So these top income quintile MSAs are scattered all throughout the country. There is a big concentration if you look here from, say, Washington, D.C. up to Boston, the Northeast corridor, but they're scattered all around the country. And we also see that the lowest 20% of income quintiles, the ones in dark blue, are also scattered more or less in various areas around the country. If we zero in on Louisiana in particular, you can see Louisiana has 2 MSAs that are in the second highest 20%. That would be Baton Rouge and New Orleans. We have 2 MSAs that are in the lowest 20%, right? That's Monroe and Hammond. And then in Lafayette, for example, is in the middle 20%. So there's a lot of variation even within Louisiana about per capita personal income compared to other MSAs around the southern states. And I think the reason this is important is thinking about what makes successful regions and then how does New Orleans stack up. So if we look over the past couple of decades, and I'll have a few charts to show you, I think the regions that have been most successful, and when I say successful, I mean that have kind of moved up the relative rankings, are the MSAs that have well-trained workforces. They have small firms that are dynamic and nimble. They're well connected to the outside world, and they have robust entrepreneurial ecosystems. In terms of how I think New Orleans compares, New Orleans has a pretty highly skilled workforce, especially for being a relatively small MSA compared to some of the other MSAs around the country. I think a couple other factors that are really important. The New Orleans MSA, no surprise to anybody, has an abundance of cultural amenities and quality of life factors that are really important and turn out to be important drivers of growth in the region that I'll talk about. And I think also in terms of my short time in the state, I'm really seeing a lot of enhanced cooperation among economic development groups within the region and also in cooperation with the state, with I think which I think is helping to position the region to be successful moving forward. So thinking about these successful regions, I have this to show you just really quickly, and then I'll talk about New Orleans in particular. So this is looking at a 50-year period and saying which MSAs in the country gained the most in terms of their relative position measured by per capita income, and which MSAs slid the most and fell in terms of the relative ranking. So the areas that are in gold are the MSAs where the relative ranking declined the most. And you can see it's basically concentrated in two places. There are quite a few MSAs in California where the relative rankings have declined, but then also in what I would call, the industrial heartland. So you can see in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, MSAs in that particular region with the deindustrialization, many of those MSAs have fallen down in the rankings. The areas that are in dark blue or almost black are the MSAs where we've seen the most gain in relative position over the last 50 years. And you can see the Southeast has actually done quite well. Two of those MSAs are in Louisiana. That would be Lafayette, Louisiana, and the Baton Rouge MSA. So New Orleans is not highlighted, meaning that in relative terms, the New Orleans MSA didn't advance a great deal and didn't decline a great deal either. But I want to point out one thing in particular. So looking at these gaining MSAs, I've got a number of these just highlighted in green. So these are MSAs that more often than not tend to have large research universities. The areas that have made the largest gains over the last 50 years have really been in innovation that's related to tech industries and also in healthcare. And so to the extent that Louisiana and New Orleans can be positioned in those particular markets, those are the industries over the last 50 years that we've seen the largest relative gains. So getting down specifically into Louisiana, Louisiana and the New Orleans region has really been a hotbed for entrepreneurship. So these data are from the New Orleans Business Alliance, and this is looking at basically the 10-year period post-Katrina. We saw really, really rapid growth in entrepreneurship for young entrepreneurs, also for women-owned entrepreneurs, which is the green bar, and for minority-owned establishments, which is the gold bar. So those numbers are continuing. We're still seeing really high rates of entrepreneurship in New Orleans relative to other sectors of the state, which is, again, a very positive sign. I think pivoting over to the tech sector, tech sector jobs increased 65% in the New Orleans area over the 10-year period before COVID. I think now there are more than 150 tech companies that are operating in the city, and I've highlighted a couple that I think have been very successful. Kickboard, which works in education sector, and Resilia, which provides services to the nonprofit sector. I think also the Idea Village in the New Orleans area has been very successful as well, bringing together funders and those with ideas to take some of these entrepreneurial innovators and get some of these products to market. I think also important to point out the average tech salary in the New Orleans area is about $75,000, which is quite a bit higher than the median household income, which is around 55,000. So in addition to the tech sector, we also know that creative industries are really, really important in Louisiana. I've done some research on this. This is again from the New Orleans Business Alliance, showing you that employment growth was up over 60% in the 10-year period before COVID in the creative industries. And also the creative industries and the technology industry are both industries that have a very high percentage of minority employment. So those are key sectors that really are helping drive more inclusive growth throughout Louisiana and also through the New Orleans area. More specifically in regard to New Orleans, about 10 to 12% of the region's economy is what I would classify as a creative industry. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis classifies particular industries as those being in the creative sector. And to put that number in perspective, the national average is about 3%. So essentially, the creative industry is about 4 times more important in the New Orleans economy than it is in the national economy. And anybody who's been to New Orleans obviously is going to know the importance of the creative industry. And I think the Louisiana Cultural Districts program has really helped boost the industry as well. That program started in 2007. There are now more than 100 designated cultural districts around the state, quite a few in Jefferson and Orleans Parish. And some of the research that I've done has shown that creative industry employment has expanded about 3% in these particular small geographic areas that have been designated as cultural districts. So that's something that's really helped the state and the New Orleans region in particular flourish. And then the last thing I want to just hit on quickly are what are some challenges to continued progress or obstacles that I see. And this is not going to surprise many of you, but maybe it's going to put some numbers to what you've been seeing and hearing. The first thing being, the rising cost of flood insurance. I think this is related to Deck's point about uh, the coastal climate and the coastal erosion issues that are there. And you're going to see that this is going to be related to the second issue that I talk about as well. But these data are from FEMA, and they show the change in the median flood insurance over a 10-year period. And you can see basically all across South Louisiana, flood insurance rates have increased somewhere between 100 and 500%, which is an enormous amount and obviously affects housing affordability, makes the area significantly less attractive to live. And when you compare Louisiana to the rest of the Gulf region, and that's what this is doing, you can really see there are some areas here in Florida, Southeast Florida, that premiums have risen quite a bit. Florida Panhandle, premiums have risen quite a bit, but it's really been concentrated in South Louisiana. So the increase in insurance rates that we have experienced over the last 10 years is really outpacing some of these other areas in the Southeast that we think might also be vulnerable to disruptions. So I think going forward, this is going to be a really, really important factor because obviously it plays directly into housing affordability. This is a chart showing you the median flood insurance premium for FEMA in 2023. And I want to just point out a couple things. So this is before the risk rating 2.0 was put into place. So if we look at, say, Orleans Parish, it's $795. In Plaquemines Parish, it's $842. So the median number means 50% of the flood insurance premiums in Plaquemines Parish are higher than 842, half or below that. When FEMA did their risk rating 2.0 adjustments, look how these numbers change. The numbers I'm going to show you are what FEMA says the risk rated premium should be. $1,500 in Orleans Parish, up from $795, and $5,400 in Plaquemines Parish, right, which is about over a 500% increase, which means effectively it's going to be extremely difficult for people to be able to have affordable housing there. So this is really, really an issue that I think going forward is something that we need to think about ways of addressing. And then lastly, just population growth. So this is showing you the 5-year population growth for MSAs in the South. Louisiana, unfortunately, is the only state over that period in the South that's been losing population. All the other states on net have been gaining population, and you can see pretty large losses in Houma Thibodeau and the New Orleans MSA, also in Lafayette, also in Lake Charles, also in Alexandria. So we're seeing a lot of population loss in the state. I think these are longer structural issues, but I think some of this is obviously going to be related to the rising cost of living in those particular regions. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is just where are the people moving who are leaving the New Orleans area. So the number one place, about 1 in 5 are moving to, or sorry, 1 in 4 are moving to Houston, Texas. So Harris County, Texas. About 1 in 5 are also, 1 in 4 are also going to East Baton Rouge Parish. So there's a lot of migration within Louisiana, but we're also seeing significant changes where we're losing people to Texas and also in the last couple of years, Mississippi as well, which is something that has been relatively new. So I want to turn that back over to Stephen. Stop sharing.
Excellent. Well, thank you, both for your presentations. We've got a few minutes left, and I'd like to start with kind of a general question, which you both have touched on this in different ways, but I'd like to bring it back out. I think one of the priorities for us in convening every element of the programming around reflecting on Katrina and Rita and the last 20 years is also about sparking new conversations and highlighting priorities for the path forward for Louisiana. So again, I think you've both touched on several things that certainly speak to that, but I'd like to come back to that and kind of draw out and highlight, maybe to hear from each of you what things stand out to you as maybe the top two or three things that the state should really be focused on and prioritize as we think about how we can grow the economy and grow the population of Louisiana moving forward.
Gary, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I think just segueing from my slides, I think a couple of important things, and I think they're interrelated. So I think the coastal issue is really important because it affects housing affordability. And I think in relative terms, Louisiana is not as affordable as we were 20 years ago. I think also trying to make the economy a little bit more dynamic by promoting entrepreneurship, I think can help retain population. I mean, to me, I think the single largest factor for the state going forward is trying to retain population and also have people who've left the state return to the state. I mean, one of the things that I think I say quite frequently is the greatest resource we have is people. And I think in order for the state to thrive going forward, we need to keep the talented people that we have here, and we need to bring the people who've left back.
What I would say, first of all, is it's really important to take advantage of the assets that New Orleans already has. So New Orleans is a wonderful city in terms of culture, food, the people. In the future, more and more people are going to be able to live wherever they want to live and work remotely. And you really want to make the city a place where it's a great place to live. And that means addressing education issues, which you're going to deal with in the next session, as I understand it, and other quality of life issues in the city. And then the other thing I would say is taking advantage of things that we already do well, like the tourism industry. I just finished a study on economic impact of a UFC fight. Uh, when you look at economic impact in New Orleans and compare it to an event in Newark, people stayed longer in New Orleans. Just the culture and the city makes people want to stay in New Orleans and spend time there. So building on our tourism advantage. Since 1840, we've seen advantages in ports, and there's talk of building a major port facility in St. Bernard or Plaquemines Parish. That could be a real shot in the arm. So working on quality of life and building on our existing successes is what I would say.
All right. Thank you both. We've got about a minute left, so I'm gonna wrap up our presentation today. And I'll just call out something that really struck me from both of your presentations is an appreciation for just how connected different parts of the state are economically, as well as the geographic challenges and the physical risks that are shared across regions. These aren't things that are isolated to a particular community, but are things that we see very similar effects across broad regions, if not the entire coast. And so as we think about a path forward for the state, certainly important that we're doing that collectively and with a broad view to the state as a whole. Well, thank you again both for joining us today. Thank you for all of our attendees who came to hear some great remarks and perspective on the state's economy and the path forward. This webinar will be recorded. I know that both Deck and Gary remain highly engaged in public-facing research and conversation in the public square. So I'm confident that they'll remain active and open for follow-up conversations. I think our hope through this Katrina Forward series is that we're not only reflecting on the past, but sparking new conversations about the state's future. So we will hope to carry this conversation forward in many other ways. Next month, we'll have our second webinar. I think we've got a link in the chat, and we'll follow up with all attendees and make sure that is widely available publicly for those who'd like to register to hear more about education and the changes over the last 20 years. And we'll have additional webinars later in the fall with news to be shared very shortly as those details are finalized. But thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of your day.